Welcome to Chain of Learning, where the links of leadership and learning unite. I'm your host and fellow learning enthusiast, Katie Anderson. Welcome to my guest today, Shawn Carner. He's a director of operational excellence at Genentech's Vacaville site. Shawn is an accomplished change agent with a proven ability to develop and implement business process transformations, lead teams and people, and deliver results. And Shawn is a Six Sigma black belt and has worked with Genentech since 2005. And I have had the pleasure of working with Shawn since 2017 when I first started doing some work with Roche, who is the parent company for Genentech. And Shawn and I have been partnering in many ways since then. He's joined a consortia that I have been leading in San Francisco Bay Area. And I have done work with both Roche and with Shawn's team in the Vacaville site. And Shawn came with me on one of my Japan study trips in 2019. So I'm really excited to talk with Shawn about how he has grown from a really successful technical operational excellence practitioner and leader to really a transformational change agent in this large, complex, multinational company. Shawn is such a strong link in my chain of learning, and it's been a pleasure partnering with him, and I'm excited to dive into our conversation today. So welcome, Shawn, to Chain of Learning.
Thanks, Katie. I was super honored when you asked me to come on and talk about this. So
yeah. Well, one of the reasons I decided to start this podcast, Chain of Learning, and grow from some of the other formats that I have been doing with author interviews and, for years, is that I wanted the opportunity to talk with other thought leaders and operational leaders like yourself. And so you're my first author with a new book who's on the show. And you were the first person who came to my mind because of the way you've been leading change and really inspiring me, even though I've been in some ways coaching you from the side and coming in and working with you, the way you've been taking things and evolving them and really making impactful change at your organization is really been exciting to be part of your journey. So let's get started on talking about, how did you get started in your own professional journey from a technical operational excellence practitioner with a Lean Six Sigma black belt to really becoming this more people-centered transformational change leader at a large global organization?
So we Genentech and Roche have been on really the manufacturing part of the business has been on a lean journey for the third time, I would say. Probably a lot of your listeners will connect with multiple iterations at that. So since 2017, we started this lean production system that we were going to deploy. And that was about the time that I took on the leadership role here at Vacaville. And like you said, I came from being a operational excellence, go solve the problem, fly around the world for a particular problem and go try and fix it, right? Whether that was value stream mapping or Kaizen events, kind of your typical approach. And this journey that the company has been on was really meant to be an approach that leaders led the way. So not a consultant-led approach and not a operational excellence-led approach. And so, as I took on this new role as a site leader, I was starting to think, okay, how am I going to show up differently in that role? And one of the things I wanted to do was become a coach, a better coach, because that's what I was going to do. I was going to be the primary coach for the site leaders. And I said, okay, so how am I going to do that? And try to do that intentionally, first by kind of working on myself to do that. But I really didn't know how exactly I was going to do that, because oftentimes we talk about lean coaching, but what is that, right? And when I came to the site, I tried the coaching kata as the primary approach to that, and we had some good success. I think leaders especially, found the kata questions as a way to engage in coaching, but we didn't have the rest of the framework, and so it was a little bit strained. When a leader would show up at the gemba and say, "What's your target condition?" Employees would look around like, I don't know, right? So people were doing it very robotically, if you will. And so it's like, okay, how am I going to take this approach? And really a lot of what we were doing was a tool forward lean deployment approach. And that also wasn't necessarily resonating.
Yeah, and for listeners who may not know what the kata is that Shawn's referring to, kata is a Japanese word that means routine or pattern of behavior. It's often used in martial arts to talk about the different routines that you practice and then put together. And Mike Rother developed what he's called the Toyota kata, or the improvement kata and the coaching kata, all about how do you create problem-solving capabilities in organizations. And there are some starter questions that he has, which have become really famous and known as, the improvement kata, which is what Shawn was referring to. So leaders taking a card out and literally like reading those 5 questions, but maybe it sounds like they didn't have the context behind it about what they were really trying to do, or the people they were asking the questions to.
Yeah. And I mean, I really believe that leaders lead the way by being first. And so it's like, okay, if I'm going to lead this, I should be good at the coaching kata. That was sort of the approach we were thinking at, but really using that framework to say, okay, I'm going to experiment with how my coaching conversations are going, looking at the obstacles that I was getting in the way. And I was really trying to shrink down those little experiments. So I would put each coaching conversation down as one of the experiments that I would do. And so that was maybe the little beginning of self-reflection, if you will. At that time, I was really doing a weekly kind of reflection, but I would look at each of these activities with a leader and say, well, how'd that conversation go? Well, I kind of got stuck in the middle. And so didn't really necessarily know how to progress that coaching capability, if you will.
Yeah. So, as you think back, it's about 7 years now. What was that spark or catalyst that really made you realize that there was something more that you needed to do or change to be in yourself to create the broader impact that you wanted in your organization? From moving this, being more this technical, really good expert, operational excellence person, to becoming this better coach and catalyzing broader organizational change.
Yeah. It initially goes back to when I was still a network OE practitioner, and we were starting this journey down this new lean production process. And I was meeting with senior leaders, but I might, fly to Germany, meet with a leader for a week on a particular project. We'd make a little bit of progress towards that trust coaching relationship, but then of course it'd be like, okay, this problem is moving forward. I'm off to the next one, and I was seeing that. Then maybe 6 months later, I'd come back and try and redo that conversation, but there maybe hadn't been progress in the interim time. And so that was also part of my impetus to say, maybe if I came to a site and was, the site leader for this, I could have this ongoing coaching conversation. So that was the first piece, sort of the, as you call it, the impetus or the spark. But then with my OE team here, we created a coaching program, if you will, that was maybe a little tool forward upon reflection, but we were like, okay, how are we going to do this? Because each of them was going out and coaching leaders deeper in the organization. So we needed a framework, and we based it around the Mike Rother's kata approach. But that was really kind of the kindling, if you will, that I was using to say, okay, I need to get better myself in how to do that coaching.
It's such a powerful insight, right? To know that we need to start with ourselves and have that humility to say that if I want to coach people to be coaches, I need to look at myself and how am I doing that myself. I was really intrigued when we were talking in advance of this recording. Shawn, you'd mentioned to me that because you have really taken on this practice of reflection, and more deeply, not just those weekly reflections, but much more regular reflection, you're able to go back and look at your notes from years ago and sort of look at your journey here. So talk about how the power of reflection and writing down that intention and reflection has been for you in your own transformation journey and becoming more impactful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it started, I had a mentor who recommended journaling, and it felt a little awkward at first, but I was like, okay, well, I can fill a page or so in a little notebook with, how the week went and what I was looking forward to next week. That was sort of the two questions that I would generally use. And then as I was doing more coaching of individuals, it was a place to sort of, okay, this was the conversation that I just had with whoever, right? The head of manufacturing or something like that. And a place to sort of capture that ongoing conversation, because as you well know, the coaching conversation spread over multiple sessions. And if you have a lot of people that you're coaching, they kind of get jumbled together. So that was part of it. But also, I was in a new role. I was now a leader, a senior leader, site leader. And I was, in a way trying to learn about what I was doing. And for many years, I always had this sort of reflection bias, if you will. And just putting it down on paper was sort of is actually very useful for exactly what you said, looking back and saying, oh, wow, I have grown quite a bit over time. I must say, since meeting you, it's now been even more intentional as a learning activity. That is the main piece. I think you always say that learning begins with the reflection piece of that, and so I think that's been a kind of a powerful. It's a tool, right? But it is a behavior, if you will, to do.
Well, right. Well, we need the tools, right? The tools support the practice, but the tools without purpose or understanding of why they're being used and what they're used for, then that's where the challenge comes in, as you talked about before. But that structure for practice, or the tools to enable practice, that's where the power of tools really come in. But if we only lead with tools and not all the other understanding of the reason why, then it's like we're just hitting the hammer, but for what reason we don't really need to be putting in a nail. I was reflecting too, Shawn, about what you said about the amount of time it takes to really coach, that you're flying around the world, coaching a leader, and then maybe 6 months later coming back. And I see this a lot in the other clients I work with as well, who especially have global sites and, their coaches are spread thin. I think the power also is that you've been able to be there and your team there and like walk by, on the side with the leaders to really develop those daily practices. What have you seen as having shifted from this more sporadic, flying in and out and sort of helping solve the problems and maybe a little bit of coaching to really being there on the site? How has that type of role shifted your ability to really influence change?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways easy to look back over 7 years and be like, wow, we've come a long way. But when you're in it day to day, it just seems like a constant slog that you're not really making much progress. And lots of different conversations, right? But there's definitely some, I think, from what I've had, good stories or experiences that sort of energize me, where I see leaders, today for example, creating their A3s without being asked or even necessarily supported by an OE professional. 7 years ago, it was A3 was a tool, a technique that was only practiced by an OE professional when there was a project we're going to kick off and we're going to do this project charter. One of my employees, Jason, always talks about that a coach's gemba is someone's mind. And so how can you see that thinking, if you will, without asking questions? And I think in Isayo, Yoshino, and John Shook's discussions around A3, they always also talk about that, right? Like, how do you know where to coach unless someone writes it down? So in many ways, that A3 thinking approach, I think it has been an artifact, if you will, of the lean culture that we're able to see now. But through that period of coaching, it was really a lot of, behavioral observations. My team would go to people's huddles and count up how many questions they were asking and then come back and provide that feedback to the individual, which it originally may have seemed odd to people. And I feel like since that time, my own coaching of people has really evolved quite a bit. It's not so mechanical in that sense, right? Of like counting up the number of questions. It's more asking good questions of them.
Yes, and having that framework as well to how to ask questions. And some of the A3, which for listeners who aren't as familiar with that, it's a tool that was developed at Toyota, and A3 is just the size of paper, but it really has a structured problem-solving process to it. And Isao Yoshino, who Shawn mentioned, is the subject of my book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and has really helped bring that concept. And he and John Shook together, out into, beyond Toyota to others as well. So we'll put the links to the book and more information there in the show notes. And Shawn, let's dive into this topic of asking questions. This is one of the biggest challenges that I see leaders, and actually all of us as human beings with, is like, we want to help by giving the answer. And to be really effective and also making this shift from being this like expert problem solver, either as a leader or as an operational excellence, consultant or coach in an organization, we have to do what I call break the telling habit. And this is one of the things that, I started working with the very first thing with Roche back, 7 years ago, all the site heads in Basel, and then continued to do some work with you and the team in Vacaville. So let's dive into like breaking the telling habit and the power of questions. And how have you found it? How have you started to really break your own telling habit? And what are some of the results or impact of that you've seen with yourself and the teams that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you often talk about starting with purpose, right? Like, what is your purpose as a leader, as a person? Why are you here on this earth? And actually, I often start my coaching engagements with anyone, no matter what level in the organization, with that kind of idea in mind. And, if I ask myself, what is my purpose with this individual, is I want them to develop, right? I want them to find their way through life, if you will, right? It's not about this particular problem or this job. And so when you start there, it becomes very clear that if you tell them, I know you teach us this idea that if you tell someone, you're robbing them from learning, right? The ability to learn. And, there is that continuum. I struggled with this quite a bit, right? Because as a leader, or a manager, if you will, right? You have a responsibility, especially from a safety standpoint, maybe in our industry, a compliance standpoint. If you see something that is unsafe or not compliant, you have to stop it, right? And in that case, you're telling someone what to do. But on that spectrum or that continuum, there's also a space for learning, development, and growth. And that's where asking the questions is very powerful. I had one coachee, mentor, if you will. She was an employee in my chain who gave me some feedback at one point that no one had ever asked her what her purpose was. And that really hit home. Like, wow, this is powerful. And having her, she didn't have an answer when I asked her, obviously, right? And she had to reflect on it and come back over several sessions to say, okay, I think this is my purpose. And of course, there's tools and things we can do to explore that purpose with each individual. But that is very powerful when you have almost that breakthrough, because then the employee, and in this case, it's the person, if maybe that purpose is not aligned with what they're doing, then now it's a gap, right? They can work towards that. And whether it's development or whether it's a new role, maybe even a new role with a company. I had a former employee who ended up taking a role in HR outside of operational excellence once we explored that. So I thought that's kind of one of these key elements of asking the questions. And it is a habit, right? We absolutely have all this experience that we want to give people, but that experience that that you have, you learned it by experiencing it as opposed to by being told it. And this, I have another sensei, I use the lean term, right? Another lean teacher who taught me about this idea of the Batari model. And to me, this was a fundamental shift in my lean thinking, because this idea of culture and behaviors are the things that we can see, above the surface. But behaviors are made up of all kinds of things, right? Our values and our beliefs, which come from our experiences, right? And so that's how we shift organizational culture, is we have a ton of new experiences, hopefully positive, because this can work in the negative as well. But if you have those experiences, behaviors change. And that's why leaders need to lead the way by being first. And so to me, those experiences, like the questioning, right, having people think about their own purpose, use that example. I could tell them what their purpose was, but that would be silly, right? That it's individual to each person. And then they're also experiencing me in a different way as a leader in a different kind of context in that situation, right? And so that's also shifting the culture of the organization. Even if you think it's just one person, right? I'm just one person to one person. That seems like very slow, but it has a lot of knock-on effects kind of downstream.
Well, absolutely. And this is like really going back to this concept of a chain of learning, right? So it's maybe one person, but then they're going to impact someone else. And this is where it grows and amplifies and strengthens across an organization to really become this like mesh that's supporting each other. And going to that purpose too, I found that if we ask people to really talk about purpose, you've had this experience in all the workshops we've done together at Genentech. We have people draw their purpose and share their purpose and talk about it, the very same thing. There's such common, themes. It's around people around them, their family, their community, coworkers, usually learning and growing, helping other people to do that. And so when we can like kind of re-anchor on that, it just helps us remind ourselves about the humanity of the role. And then leaders too, and I've talked about this before of leaders just realizing your purpose isn't always to have the answer. It's about, as you said, really helping other people to learn how to get to that answer, and like that can like remind us to like stay out of our habit of telling as well. One of the things that's really stuck with me from a few years ago, and we talked, we were doing some shared reflection on of our work together. And you made this comment that was like, "Whoa, this is really powerful." Where you said that you feel like you now have this leadership superpower, and it's so simple. I'd love for you to dive into that and share with everyone listening about your leadership superpower and how that came to be.
Yeah, and really, it is simple. It refers to a little bit about the asking questions versus telling. And then also what you describe in your book that Isao Yoshino talks about, right, is setting the direction, providing support, and then ultimately developing self, right? And so it's when we ask leaders to be lean leaders, we often say that, and then it's just sort of ghostly, right? Okay, what does that mean? How is that different? I've spent my entire career being a telling leader, right? That's typical command and control kind of leadership. And so then what do you put in sort of, the standard work, if you will, behind that? And so it's as simple as that, providing that direction. That direction is not telling people what to do, but a place to go. It doesn't mean you release all, because I think people get stuck in that, right? They're like, oh, I can't tell, so now I'm just going to sit there as a silent leader, right? And actually, you still have a lot of responsibility as a leader to guide the organization through coaching, right? And this actually aligned really well with how Roche as a company was asking leaders to behave. They were saying, leaders needed to follow this idea of being visionary. They needed to architect the structure of the organization. They need to be a catalyst and be a coach. And so, sort of these things all aligned that in this case, from a superpower standpoint, right? Now I had clarity of what my purpose was, because we did a lot of work on that. And from that, I could go and still set direction, right? Still say, oh, we're going to Mars. Okay. But then instead of telling people, how do you get to Mars? I could ask them, in your particular work, what do we need to do to get to Mars, right? And obviously the answer is going to be different in different organizations. And we've started to build that into the way that we set up our strategy deployment as well. Because now as a leadership team, we're not telling people what to do. We're setting directions, specific directions, or intentions, if you will. But then we're asking them, okay, you're in engineering. How do you get to Mars? You're in maintenance. How are you going to maintain what engineering is doing, or whatever, right? As an example. And so the superpower is really that clarity of purpose, the intention of what it is to be a leader, to ask these questions. And then now a framework by which when I sit with anyone. So I now, people sometimes think it's insane, but I have, 30, 35 people that I coach on a fairly regular basis from all levels of the organization. Clearly, I have an accountability with my peers on the leadership team, but, I've got all the way down to manufacturing and QC technicians who somehow through the work you've done maybe, or, I lead this, sponsor this next gen group that they've also partnered with you. And so that's where some of these individuals come from. But clearly they find value in the conversations. A lot of those are like development type conversations. But again, it provides like a power, right? It makes it not easy to do the work, right? You still got to do the work, but it provides some clear framework that you can do that. I had the opportunity to lead a couple manufacturing groups, and that was, quite a development challenge for me. All of a sudden I had 70 people reporting to me on 4 different shifts, 24 hours a day. And this was the approach that I went in there and said, okay, I'm not the expert, the process expert in this area, but I have my questions. So I can go in there and learn what these people are thinking, what makes them tick, but then also how are they thinking about the organization, right? And you would think that would be the way that it should be, right? The people closest to the work, they know their work. How can someone who, worked in manufacturing 20 years ago come in and say, oh, you should do it this way? That doesn't make much sense. And there's a great story there where I was coaching one of my supervisors who then took the learnings and started training his shift with this. And then one of the individuals on the shift was leading one of these lean improvement teams. And he was like, I want to use this approach with those individuals to grow them. So it really was the chain of learning and was very powerful because at my direct report level, he was reflecting, he was using the tools, if you will, on that. And then one of his reports was doing the same. And I just happened to be coaching both of them. So I could kind of see how well the supervisor was doing on that. And it wasn't about perfection, right? It was really about having those great conversations. And you could see both kind of spinning up and making progress because they were having that reinforcing impact and then also having the conversation with me. Right. And very quickly, my boss was like, what are you doing in that area? I was like, I don't know. I'm not doing anything. I'm just asking questions. Right. And so that's where the kind of the superpower thing came from, because it's like, this is fairly simple. Like, why isn't everyone doing it? And obviously every leader has their own style, but for me, that really worked quite well and continues to work.
Yeah, I love that story. I was so happy when you shared it with me. And also, I think it's well, one, it's great that you had this opportunity to be, an operational excellence leader, but then also moving into an operational leader role and how to apply those same skills and not knowing the context of the work. And I think a lot of leaders would feel like, or in a new space, that they need to come in and show that they know things, or, assert their knowledge versus assert their, like, I know this is where we need to go, but asking those questions. And I guess, I don't know if humility is the right word, but just being able to sort of reframe for yourself what a quote unquote good leader means. And that this really is that superpower that amplifies learning and results. I remember you also shared with me, though, that if I recall this correctly, that you had to be patient too and give them space to fail. Like, you were setting out you let them give space for what they thought the goals were going to be. And what they first came back with, it was something you were like, oh, I don't know if that's right. But you're like, I'm going to let them learn. We're going to just do this in cycles. What was that experience like? And maybe give a little more context if I'm remembering that right.
Yeah, you remember it quite well. I'd actually kind of forgotten about that story. And it's a good anecdote to kind of talk about this, because as I would say it's a struggle to go from your telling habit, it's up here, right? How do you set your intention? I look at that frequently to get out of your telling habit, because it's a natural thing to come in and you're constantly almost making critiques of what's happening. And you have to come back to, okay, what is my intention here as a leader? That's right. I want them to grow. And sure, I could short circuit. It would be faster for me to tell them, no, that's not good enough. But in the situation of maybe setting goals or a development action, right, there's plenty of room. We have to remember there's room to grow, and it takes a long time for this to, even, right, I was reflecting the day before our conversation that I've been on this journey for 7+ years. That's quite a long time. And I would say, I don't feel like I'm a perfect leader, right? I have room to grow, but it's been kind of this intentional journey. So kind of keeping that in mind, and that particular anecdote you're talking about was in a goal setting, and I was trying to put on the set direction, provide support, and develop self, right? And go through the process and say, okay, we're going in this direction. The leadership team still set the high level direction of the organization, but then it was up to each sub-organization to basically set the outcomes that they wanted for the year or for the quarter, I think is what we were doing it as. And the team at the time had set a fairly low bar for what the activity was, but ultimately said, okay, we'll learn from that. And I actually kind of forget the specifics of what the goal language was. It's probably not that relevant for our conversation, but ultimately, at the end of the quarter, they realized that the goal they had set, I think it was actually, now that I say it, was we want perfect operating equipment. But we were a manufacturing group, and it was actually the maintenance organization's accountability to have perfect equipment. So at the end of the cycle, the first 90-day cycle, they went, you know what? We didn't have accountability to drive that. They did a ton of great experimentation, right? They reached out to maintenance and tried to get better clarity about what it was that they were, kind of the pain point that we were feeling in manufacturing. But the basic learning is they couldn't move the needle on that particular KPI because it wasn't theirs to own, basically, right? But they learned, it took, and then we had, it was a good opportunity to have questions and discussion about that. And so then on the next cycle, and I think it brings up a good point, is that you need to right size your learning cycles. In my own practice, I mentioned the PDCA kata process, because if you shrink them, you have multiple chances to learn. But if you go, I'm going to get better as a leader and make an entire year's sort of target, you only have one bite at that learning apple at the end of the year. So if you could, set daily, weekly, monthly kind of targets, you have more sort of learning opportunities, if you will. And then you can adjust, right?
So much rich learning in that. And I really give kudos to you, Shawn, for I think a lot of people's first instinct would be they kind of know their team's kind of going off course, and this wasn't their, it wasn't in their span of control for solving, and jumped in and be like, no, you can't, that's not the right target. But you gave them space to learn and experiment and discover, and the impact, I'm sure they're just got so much better at improving and next time, and also feel so empowered that you gave them that space. So I just love that.
I must say, I remember having discussions with some of the colleagues who was helping with sort of this strategy deployment approach. Like, I don't know, is this the right thing? So a lot of times you don't know if it's the right thing or not. But, anyone who has kids also has to think about, when do you let them fail? Sometimes you just need to, right?
Yeah, well, right. And we want to help people by rescuing them. But sometimes the helping is safely, we don't want safety issues or, no-goes to happen, but give them that space to fail and that time as well. So I love that story. Shawn, you were pointing out some of the things behind you. You have a picture of a daruma from a workshop that I've had, a lot of other Japan souvenirs as well. Oh, your daruma. Yes. Shawn has
daruma from Japan.
A daruma from when he came with me on Japan. And well, maybe that's a good segue too of, Shawn had what I was so excited that he and 3 others from Genentech joined me on my May 2019 cohort on my Japan study trip. And, a lot of people say, well, why go to Japan to learn about continuous improvement and leadership? And there's so much, we could have a whole episode on this, but I'm just curious, what for you as a lean leader, as a transformational change leader, what was the power of going to Japan on my trip?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it felt like a trip of a lifetime from a lean practitioner standpoint, right? It's like going to the source, really going to the Gemba, right? Go and see for yourself where lean started. And I really liked the sort of following the Toyota value chain, as well as seeing some other companies, and what's the secret to this lean thing? How do they make it, seem so easy? And I'd say one of my big takeaways, right, is we talked about coaching takes time to grow and build, that whole chain, that whole conversation with someone. And the same thing from a lean standpoint is it takes effort and time. And it's not like Toyota just, overnight became a lean company. They've been doing that for 40, 50, 100 years. And so kind of the takeaway for me from the trip and something that you helped us explore is what artifacts of the lean culture are because of the Japanese culture. And then therefore kind of my takeaway was, okay, how do we leverage the key principles in our culture, not try and become Japanese, but what are the things that, say, in the culture of Genentech or the culture of Vacaville, or more broadly, are those cultural elements, and then align lean to that. Because a lot of the things that we saw in Japanese culture have direct connections to how lean is practiced. But, when we read the literature and we look at all the books, we don't see that at all. No one starts off with this is the Japanese culture, so this is why they do these things in the lean framework, right? We then see all these tools and we go, okay, I'm going to go and apply the tool piece of it. So in many ways, maybe after going to Japan, I sort of okay, I'm going to calm down a little bit on some of the tool side. And actually it shows up in my coaching. We talked about this briefly, but in a tool forward approach, you might come to a bunch of leaders, do a training and say, you should all, this is telling, do leader standard work, right? And that's exactly what we did. And then there's always the few that are like, okay, yes, I'm going to go do it. I'm going to create my leader standard work. Can you give me a template? Sure, here's a template. First failure. And then from there, maybe 3 months later, there's almost no one using leader standard work because they don't have the sort of connection to the cultural elements, if you will. And the why isn't really clear, right? It's a tool. And so in the coaching side of things, I often start with what is your purpose? We explore, why are they here on earth? And then as we get deeper into that conversation, we talk about, especially if it's a leader, what is the culture that they're trying to create with their team or their department, depending on their level. And that might be a foreign concept to people, but trying to expose also that how leaders act and behave is how people experience them, and therefore that's the culture that you create. And so then, this has happened, 30, 40 times, where then finally, after it takes 3-4 months, someone will come to me and say, okay, Shawn, got my purpose. I know where I want to go, but I'm struggling to get it done. It's like, oh, you know what? I have this tool for you. It's called leader standard work. We're going to write down all those things, write down your intention, and then you have a way to check in on that, right? So that's one of those, wasn't necessarily a direct learning from the trip to Japan, but it was after that where I started being like, it really is about the people. Even Toyota, what's the quote, right? We make great people.
Yeah, we make people so that we can make cars.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so, and that's like plastered all over the place. And that was kind of an aha as well, that, we happen to make, cancer-saving drugs, but what we're doing is developing people, especially as leaders. And the manufacturing of, the medicine is not secondary, but is the outcome of that great activity.
Yeah. So where Toyota also says, great thinking, great products. So like by engaging people, leveraging their great thinking, that's how it's the way we're going to be able to make the cars or the cancer saving drugs. We often have it backwards in our culture. We focus on we need that result, and maybe people are an afterthought. So I talked about this on some past episodes too. So if you're listening, go back and listen. I'll link to some of those in the show notes as well. I want to point out too that Shawn is an amazing graphic notes artist, and he has a visual summary of the trip from Japan also right behind him in his office underneath a picture of a Daruma. And I'll put a picture of that in the full episode show notes on my website because it's really cool. Shawn's skills amaze me in his ability to graphically represent, making it visual of key concepts and takeaways.
I'm a visual learner, so it helps me learn. But again, it comes back to the purpose. This is not art. This is about how to communicate in a simple way, right? And so that's part of, I guess, my purpose and my approach to helping people see problems, right?
Yep.
And so oftentimes it's not, it can be an overused tool, but it is a useful one sometimes.
All right. Making it visual, making it visible. And there are many ways to do that, and keep it simple, right? It doesn't have to be this whole elaborate thing. It's like going back to the drawing your purpose, or even when you're doing a value stream map, or draw what the problem is, like get it out, show it visually. Cause sometimes the words are hard to, there's too many words, and the visual can really synthesize it. And I just want to call it too that, just for people who are listening, one of the key things about not all of Japan culture is the same as Toyota culture as well too. So there are things that Toyota really leveraged, but there are things they had to overcome too. So this can work in whatever culture you're in, but knowing the history and like the sort of the reason behind it really provides that richness, and it all goes back to people. The only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning, as I learned from Mr. Yoshino. Yeah. So Shawn, we're so much, we could go on and talk about so many things, like setting daily intention and reflection and how that's the source of learning, and we'll have to have another talk conversation. But, if you think back to, yourself 10, 15 years ago, what advice would you give to yourself or, other current listeners who are earlier in their careers and looking to make this change or this shift from being, sort of an operational excellence doer to really a transformational change leader, making a real broad impact with changing culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. It would be great to go back. Sometimes you go like, where did the last 10 years go or 20 years go? But definitely, I already referenced sort of this Batari model that I learned from William Botha. And to me, it speaks to the why of lean. Even we kind of touched on it with Toyota a little bit there. In the space of culture, again, I started probably like many people with this very tool forward thing. And even Kaizen is fun, right? We love solving problem, going out and having a workshop with a bunch of people. But once I learned that, I was like, oh, the whole point of having a Kaizen and many Kaizen is to have a high positive experience around problem solving and change. And when you have that in a team setting, right, you're growing and developing the people in that event. And they're, depending on where they are in the organization, they're learning how to present in front of senior leaders. They had a positive ability to make a change, which maybe was bugging them in their day-to-day work. And it's that, not necessarily the problem solving, but the experience that they had that then gets codified into their values, let's say, at work. And that shows up as a behavior, which is now, if you do that a sufficient number of times, becomes the culture of the organization. And so similarly, if they experience leaders telling them what to do all the time, they're going to check their brains at the door when they walk in every day, and they're not going to think, right? And leaders are constantly saying, how do I engage my employees? And why aren't they thinking critically about problems? Well, that's because you, the leader, has been essentially brainwashing them and saying, okay, sir, or ma'am, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to do, right? And it's not intentional, but that's what's happening. And so, telling my younger self again is, if we as leaders show up in a different way, even one person can have quite a big impact on culture. Clearly, if you can get a majority of your leaders acting and behaving in this way, then you accelerate those kinds of changes in the organization. And all of a sudden you have these engaged, happy people because, you're talking about development all the time. You're giving them projects that are focused on those things that they say they wanted to develop too. Obviously, you're a business. You have to do the businessy things, and you can't just, go off in every direction. But there are ways to intentionally build capabilities, grow your people. And so that's where, again, connecting to the learning to lead, leading to learn framework is very powerful. You still set direction. Then the support piece, that's where you're going to coach, ask the questions, and then you're also reflecting on your own. You're learning for yourself and saying, okay, what did I learn? Maybe I need to ask that question a little bit better, right? And it's not about beating yourself up that you're not perfect. It's sort of that growth mindset. I know you had Carol DeWick on, and I loved that episode. That was excellent because that's something I often think about too. It's when you often tell people that they don't have a growth mindset, it immediately puts up their hackles like, of course I do, right? Which is a fixed mindset. So it's kind of this funny recursive loop a little bit, right? And so asking the questions is a way to open that learning and get people to think about it without telling them that they're wrong.
Yeah. And that really circles back to some of the examples you gave earlier on this episode too. So that's great advice and great advice to me as the younger organizational change leader as well. So thank you so much, Shawn. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. And it's been a pleasure partnering with you for over 7 years now. And I look forward to more. How can people get in touch with you if they're interested in reaching out or connecting or learning more about you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a website called visualgemba.com. So
Great.
either of those are good ways.
Fantastic. Yeah, you can check out more of Shawn's amazing graphic work there as well. He actually led a class that I was participated in. I learned a lot from Shawn. So Shawn is really a true strong link in my chain of learning. And it was a pleasure to have you, Shawn Carner, on the Chain of Learning podcast here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katie.